Well, good morning, and thank you for joining this policy webinar series. I'm John Wertman. I'm Esri's Program Manager for Public Policy. I'm joined today by my colleague, Bonnie Stayer, who's a Solution Engineer and Team Lead for our Emerging Business Program. In today's policy webinar, Bonnie's going to provide an overview of Esri's Community Analyst tool, a tool which provides powerful insight for public policy professionals. During the webinar, Bonnie will discuss the product capabilities at a high level and provide demonstrations highlighting the functionality of the tool. I'm now going to go ahead and turn it over to Bonnie for today's Community Analyst presentation.
All right, thank you very much, John. So I'm going to start with an overview of Community Analyst, then we'll dive into the data behind Community Analyst, and then we'll take a look at some demonstrations. So to begin, Community Analyst is a web-based application that Esri manages that connects to the larger ArcGIS platform, in this case, ArcGIS Online. And it's really designed to help organizations make informed decisions about population, resource allocation, and communities. It allows you to combine your data along with demographic, lifestyle, behavioral, and spending data from Esri. And it lets you understand that data using smart mapping, location-driven analytics, and beautiful reports and infographics. So what are some of the use cases for Community Analyst? This is not an exhaustive list, but we can start by talking about local governments that might use it for economic development, where to target new business growth, state government, looking at various types of public policy decisions and how they might impact citizens. Emergency management organizations across all levels of government can use it for disaster preparedness and understanding at-risk populations. Nonprofit organizations can use it for grant proposals, deciding between different grant proposals, and also looking for donations where there are populations likely to support their cause. And areas like healthcare, trying to understand the geographic accessibility of healthcare to citizens. So let's talk a little bit more about the Community Analyst data. So there are thousands of different metrics that are provided within this interface. So to look at some of these categories, demographics is obviously a big piece of this, and the obvious data source for that is the decennial census. So we'll include information that you typically think of, like population, households, age, race, and ethnicity. We also include data from the census's American Community Survey. So this is a survey that's done more frequently than the decennial census, but with a smaller sample size. So this survey provides information on things like school enrollment, language spoken at home, commute to work, health insurance coverage, and many other types of variables. And because it's a smaller sample size, Esri also provides a measurement of error and reliability statistics for these different variables. Now, obviously, the decennial census information can become outdated the further away you get from it. So we're currently 8 years out from the last census, and a lot can happen in that time. So Esri has an entire team of demographers that create current year estimates and 5-year projections for many of the decennial census variables. So this helps keep your analysis and maps more up to date. And we have links to documentation on our methodology for doing this and sort of the quality of the estimates that you're getting. So it's a useful addition to the data set along with the official census information. But beyond demographics, we also include information on behavioral data. And this comes from consumer surveys from third-party sources like GfK, MRI. And this can include behavioral data like how many people have written or called a politician in the last 12 months or something like that. We also include spending data. This comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey. So you could ask, how much are people spending on long-term care insurance, for example. And we also include license data from other sources such as crime indices, businesses, major malls, and traffic counts. So for example, Infogroup provides data on businesses that you can look up by NAICS or SIC code. And as we mentioned, you can also include your own data in your community analyst maps and reports. So you can bring in information on sales, donations, voting data, landscape or environmental characteristics, health statistics, whatever it is, whatever type of data that you are maintaining and that you want to use in your visualizations and analysis. So we provide a pathway for you to incorporate those variables into your data browser so that you can use it in creating color-coded maps, smart map search, which we'll demonstrate, and reports. We also include something called Tapestry Segmentation, which is a variable that Esri creates where we look at the demographics, so the standard variables that we provide by themselves, and we look at the geographic distribution and we apply a cluster analysis to those variables. And we come up with 67 what we call segments. So ways of sort of clustering the population across the country. And we give them cute names. There's some examples here. Other ones you might see are laptops and lattes and salt of the earth and things like that. So we create these descriptive flyers for each of these segments that we can link to from our reports in Community Analyst. So we can run a report and ask what the breakdown is of the dominant tapestry segments in each geographic area, and then go on and read more qualitative descriptions about these populations and understand their traits and their habits, along with their quantitative characteristics. And we can take all this data and generate maps, so visualizations, reports, and infographics. And we can do this for really any area that we want within Community Analyst. It could be a standard geographic boundary like counties or zip codes, but we can also define our own shapes, whether that's running a drive time around a point or just hand drawing a polygon on the map and asking about the populations that live within that area. All right, so let's take a look at some demonstrations. So this is the homepage for Community Analyst. I'm signed in with my ArcGIS Online account, and I've started a project where I want to look at access to farmers markets in Georgia. So in this case, we might be either a nonprofit or maybe the USDA, which operates a program funding growth of farmers markets, and we're trying to decide between some new proposed farmers markets and where they should be placed within the state of Georgia. So I'm going to zoom in here on my map, and the first thing I might want to do is add in some data for where the existing farmers markets are across the state. So I'm going to use an add data tool here, and I'm just going to import a file. I have a CSV file that I downloaded from the USDA's website that contains the locations for all of the existing farmers markets in Georgia. I'm going to import this. It finds the right location information. In that file, I have addresses as well as coordinates, and it can place those points on the map for me. I have some options here if I want to change my symbol. Maybe I want to use a different color. And then I'm just going to go ahead and save out this layer into my project. And then the next thing I might want to do is compare this to the proposed farmers markets. So I have another data set that represents those. So I'll import one more CSV. And in this case, I have a latitude and longitude for these proposed points. And again, I might change the symbol just to distinguish it from the existing ones. I'll make these green. Okay, so now I've got existing markets and proposed markets. And so now I want to start asking about the demographics in this area to understand, which one of these three are going to best benefit the population. And so one thing that we might do is just look at the total population. First, I'm going to turn off the clustering on here so we can see the distribution a little bit better. Obviously, we see a lot of farmers markets up in the north around Atlanta. But I would just want to map what the population looks like underneath these points. So I can do that by creating a color-coded map. So I choose Create Maps from Data, color-coded map, and then I can choose what variable it is that I want to map. I'm going to open the data browser, and you can see all the different categories of variables that we have. So I could dive into one of these. It shows me some popular variables at the top. If I go and look at all of them, I have several different categories to browse through, including, again, the decennial census information, some American Community Survey information, and Esri's current year estimates and 5-year predictions. In this case, I want to use the current year estimate on, I could do total population, or I could do population density. It might be a more interesting variable to look at. So I'm just going to choose that variable from the list. And this will show me at the state level, this distribution. I can change this to look at counties. And as I zoom in and out, it can show me other levels of geography. So if I zoom in, we can see obviously there's a large population around Atlanta, as we would expect. And so some of these other proposed farmers markets also occur in areas that are closer to these population centers and can, serve those larger populations reasonably well. However, in this case, our grant program may be focused on providing access to SNAP users, so citizens that are using the supplemental nutrition program and using what used to be food stamps and now our debit cards. But perhaps those are the populations that we want to better serve with farmers markets to help give them access to fresh produce. So in this case, maybe the total population isn't the best variable to look at. So I'm going to go back and cancel out of that variable. And instead, I'm going to search for a variable looking for food stamps. And we can see, again, there's some American Community Survey data on households that receive food stamps /SNAP. So I can look at either the total number of households, can look at the percentage, and then again, we also have those reliability ratings. I'm going to use the percentage today, so rather than looking at raw counts. So we can see, a number of counties that have a high, percentage of households receiving these benefits down here in the southeast or southwest. A couple things I'm going to do to improve my visualization here. First thing I'm going to do is change my base map. So instead of the streets base map underneath, I'm going to switch to a more neutral gray. And then I'm also going to add a boundary around the state of Georgia, just to highlight it and help focus my eyes when I'm looking at it. And one other thing that I can do, this data set on these existing farmers markets includes information about whether they accept SNAP payments. So I'm going to go back to my contents here and filter this data set by the SNAP attribute. So I'm going to choose SNAP, and you see there's other programs under here that we could focus on as well. But I'm just going to say where SNAP is yes. So when we do that, our map refreshes and we can see that there's even more of a disparity in the Southwest about how well these communities are being served by existing farmers markets. So in this case, rather than looking at these proposed markets around Savannah and Peachtree, we might want to consider this one down here in the Southwest that can better serve the target population for this grant program. So I could take this analysis even further if I wanted to. I can run some drive times around these points, these proposed markets, to better understand those populations in the immediate vicinity. But for now, to wrap up this particular demo, I just want to highlight some of the sharing options. If I wanted to, I can export out a PDF of this map if I want to show it to other people that I'm collaborating with. But I can also share this back to my ArcGIS Online organization. So if I have other users that want to be able to work with this in an interactive way, maybe mash it up with other data, it can be shared back to ArcGIS Online as an interactive web map. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another project. So I'll switch to my projects view here, and I'm going to take a look at another scenario where perhaps I am working for an elected official in Idaho, and education has become an important topic. We want to understand, the populations across our state, the citizens that this is affecting most. Perhaps there's an important policy initiative or piece of legislation that's being talked about or discussed, and we want to understand who's going to be impacted by it, and just kind of get a general sense of the education profile, if you will, of our state, and where people are caring the most about this issue. So we mentioned one of the ways that you can work with data is to bring in your own data. So one of the things that an elected official might be doing is tracking constituent correspondence. So anytime someone calls or writes into their office, they might be tracking that by, either a street address or maybe a zip code at an aggregate level to see, who's writing in about what topic across their state. So I'm going to add in custom data. So rather than just importing a file for visualization purposes, I want to actually work with this data in my color-coded maps and reports and things. So I'm going to add this as custom data into my data browser. So it gives me a little step-by-step overview here. When I get started, I can either copy in a layer if I know the URL to it, or more easily, I can just browse for a layer. So I can search my own content for education, and I have a layer that was already shared perhaps by our team that manages all the correspondence. So they've shared that as a layer within ArcGIS Online. I was able to browse for it, and I have a list of columns or attributes from that data set. So here I'm just choosing which of those I might want to drive my maps and reports off of. I don't really care about the zip code. That's just the level of geography that we're dealing with. And the total population is obviously something that we already have in Community Analyst, so I don't need to add that in. Mostly I would be concerned with the count of correspondence, as well as the rate of correspondence. So this was a rate that was calculated per 1,000 people, just to make it a little bit more meaningful rather than pure counts, which can really just trend with the population. So I'll save this and I'll give it a new name, education correspondence. And I can fill out some more sort of metadata about it and change the icon, how that's represented in my data browser if I want to. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to save this as is. So now I can choose to go ahead and start incorporating this data into my maps and analysis. So right off the bat, I'm going to go ahead and choose to make a color-coded map from this data. And I'll choose the rate variable. So again, these are the two variables from that data set that I said I wanted to use. So I'll use rate. And just like in ArcGIS Online and other parts of our platform, I have different ways that I can style this information. So if I wanted to change the styling theme, if I wanted to use dots instead of colors, I could do that. I can change the color ramp itself. Maybe I want to use a different set of colors, the classification method, number of classes, etc. Changing, my borders and all that good stuff. And so then I can, start taking a look at this data and analyzing it the same way I would any other variable within Community Analyst. So one thing I might want to do is just look at the areas. I just want to focus on those areas where people are obviously really passionate about this topic and have taken a lot of time to write in or call into our office about it. So I want to filter out the data and only show the zip codes where we're seeing a high rate of correspondence. So I can use this filter tool and say, maybe we'll start with 15. That narrows it down pretty well. So these are the zip codes that are clearly passionate and have something to say about this topic of education. So now that I've got my sort of area of interest narrowed down, I want to provide a nice infographic to my boss about these zip codes and about the populations within them. So what I'm going to do is just hold down my shift key and I'm going to select all of those zip codes. And we can combine those into a single site that we can use to drive a report or an infographic. So it's selected 20 features. We're just going to combine them all into one and say, tell me about the population across all those zip codes. So I can rename this, right now it's saying 20 polygons. I might just call it, education focused zips, something like that. So now I'm prompted if I want to run a report or create an infographic or do a comparison, as well as some other options for editing these areas and looking at them more closely. I'm going to run the infographics. So this takes me into a dialog where I can choose from some existing, Esri created templates for these infographics. So we can see a number of the ones we've created here, basic demographic summary. In this case, my default is this key facts infographic, transportation to work, healthcare. So some of these might be useful if we're looking at other policy issues. But in this case, I want to focus a little bit more on education. So I can create and modify, I can create a new one, or I can modify existing infographics to suit my needs. So in this case, yeah, there's some good basic facts here that I might want to include in terms of population, income, employment, etc. The business information, however, is not really relevant to this topic. So what I want to do is edit this infographic and replace this business section with something else. So I'm going to use the replace option, and here I can choose to swap in different elements. I can put in a chart or an image or text or a map, but in this case, I'm just going to add in a different infographic, so a different set of statistics or variables. In this case, to save time, I've already created a new panel. So this panel I've called school enrollment. So we had some educational attainment information already in that template, but I wanted some information on school enrollment as well. So if I wanted to create a new one, I could do that. I can use this dialog here to browse through all those data variables and add them to my selection and then create a new panel from it. But since I've already got this one pre-created, I'm just going to add this into my my template here. So now we can see that school enrollment has been swapped in where we had business information. And then I can save this out as a new template so I can reuse it in the future if we revisit this topic in future years. I don't have to recreate this. Again, for the sake of time, I've already saved it out, so we don't have to wait for that to save. So I'm just going to go back to the running reports step and running the infographics for my education focused zips. I saved it out as an education profile template, and I can go ahead and run that. And it'll show me the data specific to those 20 zip codes that I selected. So again, we can define any area that we want, and the software will tell us about the population and express it or deliver it to us in the format that we choose. So again, I can take this and now save it out. I can export it as a PDF if I want to include it in a larger report to my boss, or I can go ahead and print it out as well. Okay, so for my third example, I'm going to switch yet again to a different project. And in this case, I'm going to take on the, let me close out of this, go back to my maps. I'm going to look at a scenario around a problem that was occurring a number of years, a few years ago, like 4 years maybe, where there were breakouts of measles happening, primarily in California, I believe. So there were a lot of news articles and people talking about this outbreak and the role that vaccination plays. And so one of the news articles referenced this study from shared here at the U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health. And this is on parental delay or refusal of vaccine doses. And I kind of read through it. And if you get down far enough, you'll see some statistics on based on their study, what are the child, maternal, and household characteristics associated with a delay in vaccinations? And so, this calls out specific socioeconomic status and household characteristics, such as, households with high annual income, English speaking, college graduates, covered by private health insurance, more likely to be non-Hispanic white households. These are the characteristics of people who are likely to delay vaccinating their children, and therefore potentially putting other people in the population at risk for an outbreak of measles. So I read this and I said, oh, this is a community analyst demo. We can look at all these types of variables. So maybe you're working for a public health department in a state, or maybe it's an advocacy group that's just trying to raise awareness and do outreach on this issue. So we can use these tools to help find populations where there might be a potential outbreak. So populations that fit those characteristics, or we might want to devote resources to. So we talked earlier about sharing maps out to ArcGIS Online. We can also bring maps in from ArcGIS Online. So just as a starting point, I can search for a web map, and I've got a map already created from the 2014 data by state on measles, mumps, rubella vaccination rates. So I can bring in this as a visualization into my project. So I can see areas in pink. These are states where the vaccination rate is not as high as it is in the green states. So these might be areas to first, initially target with our outreach. So I'm going to zoom in on Colorado, since Denver specifically being the major population center. And let me just clear this map off of my view here. And I'm going to switch back my base map to go back to the streets. Okay, and the tool that I'm gonna use this time, since we've got, we looked at mapping, creating a color-coded map from a single variable like population or households receiving food stamps. But in this case, I have several variables that I wanna take into consideration. So I'm going to use another tool called the Smart Map Search. And this lets me choose up to 5 variables to find populations that meet the criteria that we want to set for those variables. So I'm going to search, do some searches and do some browsing for the variables of interest. The first one that we called out was income. So I can go to the income category, and I'm just going to use the one popular variable here, which is the 2018 median household income. So I can select that and put it into my bucket. The next one was educational attainment. So again, we have some of those educational attainment variables. If I look at the breakdown here, it kind of goes by grade level in high school, and then, diploma, some college, bachelor's, graduate. So I could just select the bachelor's degree, but really I want to consider anyone with a college degree. So I really want to choose the, combination of, associates, bachelors, and graduates. So what I can do is create a custom variable from this list. And I can say, if I go under my advanced options here, I have the same data browser, and I can choose those education variables that I'm interested in. And we'll just start saying, associate's degree plus bachelor's plus graduate professional degree. So I've got all 3 of those adding up here. And we'll go ahead and add, and I'll call this college degree. So that's now been added to my list of variables for my Smart Map search. And now I want to look for the white non-Hispanic households, and ideally those are households that have children, right? So I'm just going to search on white, and we'll bring up one of these categories that shows the household by type and children. So this is the decennial census information, and this shows family households with a white non-Hispanic householder and own children age under 18. So it's a pretty focused variable that we want to include. We might also want to look at the insurance variables. So let me search for health insurance. So under, consumer spending, there's a basic health insurance variable. There's some other interesting ones here for American Community Survey data. If I wanted to narrow it down to private insurance only, again, I could go in and create a custom variable, selecting, just the particular type of coverage, excluding things like Medicare and military health and things like that. And then, making sure I'm capturing the right age group. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to go back and choose that general health insurance variable. And then the last one that I'm going to include is, some of these news articles talked about the, likelihood of contracting measles while you travel overseas, and then that contributes to an outbreak if you're bringing that back to the U.S. So we have information on foreign trips that people are likely to take, or how many people are likely to take these trips. So if I search for that, I can find a variable on, taking a number of non-business foreign trips in the last 3 years. So I'll select that variable. So I've got 5, which is the maximum I can do. I'll hit apply. And I'll be given a dialog here that lets me, as it's animating here, use sliders to define that criteria. So I can say, what is the acceptable range of household income, or the acceptable range of people with a college degree. So notice also by default, I just selected the variables for the total number, which again can be useful in some situations, but we might want to look at a different kind of view of some of these variables, including percentages. So, where there are areas with a high percentage of people with a college degree, again, factoring out the total population behind it. Same thing for the white non-Hispanic households. And the, let's see, foreign trips, I think we use the index for. So index is a measure of, it's a comparison to a national average. So 100 is the national average for all these indices. So anything below 100 is below the national average, anything above is above the national average, right? So I'm going to use that for the foreign trips as well as the health insurance. For median household income, I am going to leave it as a raw number, and I'm just going to set a minimum threshold here of 100,000. Again, I could look up what 400% over the federal poverty level is and get more specific with it. For college degrees, I can either enter in a number here, or I can drag the slider just to see how it's adjusting, how it's affecting the tracks that we're looking at. And again, I can zoom out if I want to look at this more at a zip code level. I can do that as well. So maybe I say 30% have college degrees. I'll do another 30% here for the white non-Hispanic households. Let's just look at the national average for these. And if I'm not seeing a lot of change, again, I can continue to update these. So maybe I want to start looking more at the, really educated population. Bump this up to 50. Greater percentage of white non-Hispanic households, something like this, right? So I can start to identify those key clusters of where we're most likely to potentially have an outbreak. And so now that I've got some zip codes isolated on my map, I want to understand more about these populations and how we can do outreach to them. How can we communicate to these folks to get our message out or provide resources about vaccinations? So I'm going to define an area to run a report on, and I can either go through and select each one of these zip codes and be very precise about it. But again, for the sake of time, I'm going to use the option to just draw a polygon. So I can literally just take a freehand tool and kind of sketch around this area. It'll start drawing. There we go. And as we said, you can define any shape you want to run these reports and infographics on. So there's my custom shape. And just like the 20 polygons we had selected before for our zip codes in Idaho, I can generate a report or run an infographic. In this case, I want to highlight the Tapestry data. So we mentioned they give a lot of good qualitative information about behaviors and habits of these populations. So under the report dropdown, again, I can create my own custom reports, but I'm going to use one of the pre-generated Esri reports, and I'm going to use the Tapestry Segmentation area profile. And I'll run that. And open it. It just opens in another tab in my browser. And I can see the breakdown of those top 20 Tapestry segments and what percentage of the households fall under those categories. So over a quarter of the households in this area are what they call boombergs. And these are all hyperlinked. So I can click that name and go read more about this population. So again, these are pre-created sort of flyers and infographics that Esri's created for these Tapestry segments, describing them, reading about their neighborhoods, socioeconomic traits. Here's the quantitative measures of some of those standard demographics. So we can see how much they spend on different categories of products and services. But my favorite is the market profile. So this can tell you things like what types of cars they drive, and technology usage, and what type of media they consume, and activities and recreation that they participate in. So in reading this, one thing that I noticed was the physical fitness is a priority, including club memberships and home equipment. So fitness clubs might be a good way to try and reach out to this population if we want to put up flyers or set up information booths outside of them. So that might be one way to try and reach this at-risk population. And so that's actually something I can do in Community Analyst as well. So if I go back to my map, we've been using this little search bar up here for various things. One of the other options is a business and facilities search. So I can look for fitness clubs in and around this area. And it brings up those points for me on the map, and they're sort of clustered here. I could zoom in and break those down if I wanted to. And I see the business names over here in different ways that I can, further filter down this data if I only want to focus on a particular city or a particular industry description. I can do that, and or maybe particular business name. So now I have these locations of businesses that we can go visit. These can be exported as well if I just want to get a list of addresses that we're going to go to help reach these populations, right? And then we may also want to search for schools or clinics in the area to make sure that they're prepared for an outbreak if one would happen. So this was just a taste of what Community Analyst can do. We certainly didn't cover every single piece of functionality in the tool, but hopefully give you some meaningful examples of how it can be applied to some of the policy analysis that you might be doing. So just to wrap up, it's a web application. We saw some workflows to create maps, reports, and infographics. We saw that there are thousands of metrics available for, demographics, lifestyle, behaviors, spending, many different types of information. And this can be applied to a variety of use cases, such as resource allocation, outreach, and understanding impacts of public policy. So if you want to get started with Community Analyst, you do need to have access to an ArcGIS Online subscription. If you've already got one of those, you can register for a 21-day free trial of Community Analyst through the ArcGIS Marketplace, which is at the URL here. And you can just search for Community Analyst there, and there'll be an option to register for that free trial. If you don't have an ArcGIS Online subscription, that's okay. You can get a 21-day free trial of that as well at the URL listed. So once you've got that trial stood up, you can request access to Community Analyst in the same way. And the URL for the site itself, once you're ready to start working with it, is just communityanalyst.arcgis.com. And so I wanted to point out a couple resources. The documentation that we have online is really great for the web application itself. So, how do you use that interface? How do you navigate through that? But then we also get a lot of questions on the data. So we have a great set of documentation on this data. at that URL. And this will tell you things like the sources for the data, the vintage, how frequently it's updated, the methodology that we go through, for example, for our Esri projections. And then you can also get a variable list. So if you're interested in seeing if a particular variable exists, you can look it up in those variable lists as well. So it's a great resource. I do reference it quite frequently, and it's organized very well. So definitely check that out. So with that, I think we'll take any questions that you might have. Let's see if there's any in the panel.
So I think, Bonnie, we did have one question, and before we get to that, thank you so much for that terrific presentation on the power of community analyst. So we had one question from Kyle Negley, and he indicated that it had potentially been answered during the presentation, but let's just pose it to see how you might tackle it for other folks who might be interested. Kyle's question was, where are you able to find these interactive maps that you referenced or published demos and projects? I'm assuming projects using Community Analyst. So Bonnie, any thoughts on that question?
Sure. Well, you don't actually need any existing maps to get started with Community Analyst. You can just log into the site and start a new project on your own. So I had them pre-created just because I didn't want to go through the process of creating them each time for these demos, because it can take a minute to kind of spin up all the back-end resources. So you can just start creating a fresh one and start exploring the data and making your own maps. If you wanted to incorporate any other data, outside data, like where I searched for that vaccination rates map, or the education correspondence layer that I brought in, those were data sets that I had already shared in ArcGIS Online. So that was, data that I had already worked with and outside of Community Analyst and had published as resources to my organizational account, and then just brought them in as visualizations and data sources into Community Analyst. So in that case, if there was, a layer like that that you wanted to bring in, again, you can browse, public data layers in ArcGIS Online and bring those in as well. Or if it's something that your organization has created and shared with you, it just needs to be accessible to you through your organizational account, and you'll be able to bring it in. So hopefully that answers your question. In terms of the consulting services to help on projects or training, yeah, I think it's best to follow up with John afterwards to get more information on that.
Absolutely. We're always happy to help clients or others who want to get involved with Esri and ArcGIS to best use our products. So we can certainly help with consulting services. So I think that was the sole question we had. So again, thanks to Bonnie for a terrific presentation. And we'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Our next policy webinar in this series is going to focus on spatial analytics, and that will be held on October 17th. The link to register for that webinar will be live in the next few days, so please be sure to check back to register for that. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope all of you have a terrific day. Bye-bye.